When you become aware that you are aware. Pause there for a moment. Not the things you see, not the thoughts you think, but the simple undeniable fact that there is something it feels like to be you. Have you ever asked what in the laws of physics is actually doing that? What process in this vast universe produces the redness of red, the warmth of sunlight on your skin, the quiet sense that you exist right now? Because if we are honest, that is the strangest thing we know. Not black holes, not quantum fields, not the birth of galaxies. But this, the fact that matter arranged in a certain way does not just behave, it experiences. Now here is the shift that will guide everything we are about to do together. We have been told for decades that the brain is a computer, a biological information processing system. Neurons fire signals, propagate, patterns emerge. And somewhere in that immense network of interactions, consciousness appears. But what if that picture is incomplete? Not slightly incomplete, not missing a few details, but fundamentally wrong in its assumptions? What if computation, no matter how complex, is not the kind of process that can ever produce experience at all? Let us begin with what we know. Your brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons. Each neuron can fire up to hundreds of times per second, forming a network of roughly 100 trillion synaptic connections. This is an object of staggering complexity, a dynamical system beyond anything we have ever engineered. And yet, all of that describes structure and activity. It does not explain why there is something it is like to be that system. You can imagine mapping every neuron, measuring every electrical signal, cataloging every chemical exchange. And even if you had that complete description, something essential would still be missing. Because nowhere in that description do you find the feeling of red. Nowhere do you find the taste of sweetness. Nowhere do you find the fact that you are aware. This is not a failure of technology. It is not because our scanners are not precise enough. It is not because we need more data. It is because we are facing a different kind of problem altogether. In the 1995, a philosopher named David Chalmers gave this problem a name. He called it the hard problem of consciousness. And the choice of words was very deliberate. He distinguished between what he called easy problems and the hard problem. Now, the easy problems are not easy in the everyday sense. They are technically difficult, experimentally demanding, often requiring decades of work. But they are easy in a deeper sense. They are problems about mechanism. How does the brain process visual information? How does it store memory? How does it integrate sensory input? These are questions we know how to approach. We can build models. We can test predictions. We can refine our understanding step by step. And indeed, neuroscience has made extraordinary progress on these fronts. But the hard problem is different. Fundamentally different. It asks a question that does not seem to fit into this framework at all. Why does any of this processing produce experience? Why is there something it feels like from the inside? Consider a simple system. A thermostat. It measures temperature, compares it to a set point, and activates a response. In a very real sense, it processes information. But no one believes there is something it feels like to be a thermostat. Now consider your brain. It processes vastly more information, in vastly more complex ways. But why should that difference in complexity produce something entirely new? A private, subjective, first-person experience. This is the gap. And it is not a small gap. It is not the kind of gap that disappears when we add more detail. It is a conceptual gap, a gap between two different kinds of description. On one side, we have objective processes, electrical signals, chemical reactions, physical interactions, things we can measure from the outside. On the other side, we have subjective experience, what it feels like, something only accessible from the inside. And the question is not how they correlate. We already know they correlate. When certain brain patterns occur, certain experiences occur. The question is why. Now, over the past few decades, scientists have tried to bridge this gap using increasingly sophisticated theories. And some of these ideas are genuinely beautiful. For example, Giulio Tononi proposed that consciousness corresponds to integrated information. The idea is that a system becomes conscious when it integrates information in a unified way, not just processing inputs, but combining them into a single coherent whole. He even introduced a quantity often called phi that attempts to measure this integration. It is an elegant idea, mathematically grounded, conceptually appealing. But here is the crucial point. It tells us which systems might be conscious. It does not tell us why those systems should feel like anything at all. It describes structure, not experience. Another approach comes from Bernard Baars. In this view, the brain is composed of many specialized processes operating in parallel, most of them unconscious. Consciousness arises when information becomes globally available, when it is broadcast across the system accessible to multiple processes simultaneously. Again, this captures something real. It aligns with many experimental observations. But once again, it describes what consciousness does, not what it is. Saying that consciousness is global broadcasting is like saying that a symphony is the coordinated vibration of air molecules. It is not wrong, but it misses the essence of the phenomenon. Now you might be tempted to say, we just need more time, more data, more refined models. Give neuroscience another 50 years and it will solve the problem. And perhaps it will. We should never underestimate the power of careful systematic inquiry. But there is a reason some scientists have begun to suspect that something deeper is missing. The issue is not that we lack detail. The issue is that we may be using the wrong conceptual framework entirely. Because all of these theories share a common assumption. They assume that consciousness emerges from computation. That if you arrange information processing in the right way, if you build a system of sufficient complexity, experience will simply appear. But that assumption has never been demonstrated. Not once. We have built increasingly powerful computers, systems that can simulate weather patterns, predict protein structures, generate language, even mimic aspects of human conversation. But nowhere in any of these systems do we find evidence of experience. We see behavior. We see output. We see function. But we do not see awareness. And more importantly, we do not even know what it would mean to detect it from the outside. This is where the idea that consciousness is computation begins to break down. Because computation at its core is about manipulation of symbols according to rules. It is syntactic, not semantic. It operates on structure, not meaning. And experience, whatever it is, appears to belong to a completely different category. Now I want to be very careful here. This is not an argument against neuroscience. It is not an argument against studying the brain. The brain is clearly involved in consciousness. When the brain changes, experience changes. That is not in question. The question is whether the brain understood purely as a computational system is sufficient to explain consciousness. And that is where the doubt begins. Because if you look closely, what we have are correlations. Certain brain states correspond to certain experiences. But correlation is not explanation. It tells us that two things occur together, not why one gives rise to the other. And this brings us to a very uncomfortable possibility. What if consciousness is not something that emerges from computation at all? What if it requires a different kind of physical process? A process that is not captured by classical physics. A process that does not reduce to information processing. If that is the case, then we have been asking the right question, but using the wrong tools. And that possibility, as strange as it sounds, leads us directly into the most successful and most puzzling theory in all of physics: quantum mechanics. Now, do not worry. We are not going to jump into mysticism. We are not going to abandon rigor. We are going to proceed carefully, step by step. Because if consciousness truly is not computation, then somewhere in the laws of physics, there must be a process that can account for it. And the task before us is to find it. We now move one step deeper, not into speculation, but into structure, into the exact assumptions that underlie how we think about the brain. Because before we replace an idea, we must understand it completely. And the dominant idea is this: the brain is an information processing system. Neurons receive inputs. They integrate signals. They fire outputs. Networks of neurons form circuits. Circuits form systems. Systems produce behavior. And at every level, what we see is the transformation of information. Patterns in, patterns out. From this perspective, consciousness is often described as a high-level, emergent property. Something that appears when the complexity of the system crosses a certain threshold. But here is the first question we must ask. What does emergence actually mean in physics? When we say temperature emerges from molecular motion, we can trace that precisely. We can define temperature in terms of kinetic energy. When we say pressure emerges from particle collisions, we can derive it from first principles. In every successful case of emergence, the higher level property is reducible to the lower level dynamics. So if consciousness is emergent, we should be able to do the same thing. We should be able to point to physical processes and say, here is where experience comes from. Here is how it arises. Here is why it must occur. But we cannot do that. And this is not a minor technical gap. It is a categorical difference. Because temperature and pressure are objective properties. They exist from the outside. Consciousness does not. It exists only as experience. Now let us examine the computational picture more closely. Computation is defined by the manipulation of symbols according to rules. A system receives an input state, applies a transformation, and produces an output state. This is true whether we are talking about a silicon chip or a neural network. The key point is this: computation is entirely defined by structure and dynamics. It does not depend on meaning. You can take a computation and reinterpret it in infinitely many ways. The same pattern of bits could represent numbers, images, or meaningless noise depending on how you assign meaning to it. The physical process itself does not care. And this leads to a critical realization. Computation is syntactic. It operates on form, not content. But experience is not syntactic. When you see the color red, you are not processing a symbol that stands for red. You are experiencing red. There is no gap between representation and reality in experience. The experience is the thing itself. So now we face a contradiction. We are trying to derive something intrinsic from something extrinsic. We are trying to get experience from structure. And nothing in the definition of computation contains even a hint of experience. Now, let us return to the major theories and examine them under this lens. Giulio Tononi proposed that consciousness corresponds to integrated information. The more a system integrates information, the more conscious it is. This is an attempt to quantify consciousness, to turn it into something measurable. And that is exactly what physics requires. But the problem remains. Why should integrated information feel like anything? You can calculate integration. You can assign a value. You can compare systems. But nowhere in that calculation does experience appear. It is an identification, not an explanation. Now, consider Bernard Baars. This theory describes consciousness as a global broadcasting process. Information becomes conscious when it is accessible across the system. Again, this captures something real. We know that conscious perception involves widespread brain activity, but let us ask the same question. Why should global availability produce experience? Why should broadcasting information feel like anything? There is no answer within the theory itself. Because the theory is still operating within the computational framework. It is still describing how information moves, not why it is experienced. Now you might say, perhaps experience is simply identical to these processes. Perhaps there is nothing more to explain. But this is not an explanation. It is a declaration. It is equivalent to saying that heat is motion, without explaining how motion gives rise to temperature. In physics, we do not stop at identification. We demand mechanism. And here is where the computational model begins to show its limits. Because no matter how complex the computation becomes, no matter how many layers we add, no matter how many connections we map, we are still manipulating symbols. We are still operating within a framework that has no concept of experience. Now let us consider a thought experiment. Imagine a perfect simulation of the brain. Every neuron, every synapse, every signal reproduced exactly. From the outside, this system behaves exactly like a conscious human. It speaks. It responds. It claims to be aware. But the question remains. Is it experiencing anything? And more importantly, what in the simulation would make it experience anything? Because the simulation is still just computation. It is still just state transitions. There is nothing in the physics of that system that requires experience to exist. This is not a philosophical puzzle. It is a physical one. We are asking whether the laws of physics as currently understood contain the ingredients necessary for consciousness. And the answer so far appears to be no. Not because we have not looked hard enough, but because the framework itself does not include the right kind of process. Now, at this point, we must be careful. It is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that if classical physics cannot explain consciousness, then the answer must be something mystical. That is not what we are doing. We are not abandoning physics. We are extending it. Because there is one part of physics that does not behave like the rest. One part where the relationship between observer and system is fundamentally different. One part where the act of measurement cannot be ignored. That part is quantum mechanics. Now, before we go there, we must recognize what we have established. Computation describes structure. Consciousness is experience. And there is no clear path from one to the other within classical physics. So the question becomes sharper. If consciousness is not computation, then what kind of physical process could it be? To answer that, we must leave the familiar ground of classical systems and step into a domain where reality itself behaves in ways that challenge our deepest intuitions. A domain where a system can exist in multiple states at once, where probabilities are fundamental, where observation plays a role in determining what is real. In the next step of our journey, we will examine that domain carefully, not as mystics, but as physicists. Because if there is any place in our current understanding of nature where something like consciousness could emerge, it is there. Now we step into unfamiliar territory. Not because it is speculative, but because it is precise in a way that challenges intuition. We leave behind classical descriptions and move into the domain where the rules themselves begin to change. Quantum mechanics. Let us begin carefully. In classical physics, a system has a definite state. A particle has a position and a velocity. A system evolves deterministically. If you know the present, you can in principle predict the future. This is the framework in which computation naturally lives. Clear states, clear transitions, clear rules. But quantum mechanics does not work that way. A system is not described by definite properties but by a wave function, a mathematical object that encodes probabilities. Before measurement, a system can exist in a superposition of multiple states, not as a lack of knowledge, but as a physical reality. And here is the crucial point. The transition from possibility to actuality is not described by the same rules that govern evolution. This is known as the measurement problem, and it is one of the deepest unresolved issues in physics. A quantum system evolves smoothly according to the Schrödinger equation. But when a measurement occurs, the wave function appears to collapse. One outcome becomes real. The others disappear. The theory tells us how to calculate probabilities. It does not tell us what physically causes this collapse. Now, for decades, physicists have debated this. Some interpretations avoid collapse entirely. Others accept it as fundamental. But no consensus has been reached. And this is where a remarkable idea enters. A mathematical physicist named Roger Penrose proposed that this collapse is not just a mathematical update, but a real physical process. And more importantly, a process that is not computable. Now we must understand what that means. Penrose argued that there are truths in mathematics that cannot be derived by any algorithm. This result comes from Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which shows that any sufficiently powerful formal system contains statements that are true but unprovable within the system. Penrose made a bold step. He suggested that human understanding can access such truths, which implies that the mind is not equivalent to an algorithm. If that is correct, then consciousness cannot be computation. But this is only an argument. To make it physics, we need a mechanism. Penrose proposed that the answer lies in gravity, specifically in the relationship between quantum superposition and space-time geometry. When a mass is in superposition, it corresponds to multiple possible geometries of space-time. Penrose suggested that this situation is unstable. Nature cannot sustain multiple incompatible geometries indefinitely. At a certain threshold, the system undergoes an objective reduction, a real physical collapse, not caused by observation, but by the structure of space-time itself. This process is not random in the usual sense, and crucially, it is not computable. Now we must ask the obvious question: where in the brain could such a process occur? This is where Stuart Hameroff enters the story. Hameroff studied structures inside neurons called microtubules. These are cylindrical protein assemblies about 25 nanometers in diameter, present in large numbers within each neuron. Traditionally, they were thought to serve structural roles, maintaining cell shape and organization. But Hameroff proposed something different. He suggested that microtubules could support quantum processes. Within the protein structure, there are regions where electrons are not localized to a single atom. Their wave functions extend across multiple sites. This opens the possibility of quantum superposition within the biological environment. When Penrose and Hameroff combined their ideas, they proposed a theory called orchestrated objective reduction, often abbreviated as Orch-OR. The idea is precise. Quantum superpositions occur within microtubules. These superpositions evolve over time. When they reach a certain threshold determined by gravitational effects, they undergo objective reduction. Each such event corresponds to a moment of conscious experience. Now, this is a strong claim, so it must be examined critically. One of the most important criticisms came from Max Tegmark. Tegmark calculated how quickly quantum states would lose coherence in the warm, wet environment of the brain. The result was extremely short timescales, on the order of 10 to the minus 13 seconds. This is far shorter than neural timescales, which are on the order of milliseconds. If this calculation is correct, then quantum coherence could not play any functional role in brain activity. At first glance, this seems decisive. But physics does not end with a single calculation. We must examine assumptions. Tegmark's model treated the brain as a highly noisy environment with no protective structure. But biological systems are not random. They are organized at multiple scales. And over the past decades, we have discovered something unexpected. Quantum effects can exist in biological systems under conditions once thought impossible. In photosynthesis, energy transfer occurs with efficiencies that suggest quantum coherence. Experiments show that excitations explore multiple pathways simultaneously, even at room temperature. In bird navigation, certain molecules exploit quantum spin states to detect magnetic fields. These are not speculative ideas. They are experimentally supported. So the question becomes more subtle. Not, can quantum effects exist in biology? But where and how they are sustained. Hameroff and Penrose argue that microtubules provide a structured environment. Their geometry, their internal organization, and the surrounding molecular arrangement may reduce decoherence. This is still under investigation. But it is not ruled out. Now, let us connect this back to consciousness. If objective reduction events occur in the brain, and if each event corresponds to a moment of experience, then consciousness is not continuous in the classical sense. It is a sequence of discrete events. Interestingly, brain activity shows oscillations around 40 cycles per second, often associated with conscious awareness. This suggests a timescale that could match such events. Again, this is not proof, but it is a consistency. Now, step back and observe what has happened. We began with a problem. How does experience arise from physical processes? Classical computation did not provide an answer. Quantum mechanics introduces a new kind of process, one that is not purely computational, a process where the transition from possibility to actuality is fundamental. And Orch-OR suggests that this transition may be identical to a moment of experience. This is a profound shift. Consciousness is no longer something that emerges from computation. It is something that arises from the deepest structure of physical law. Now we must be honest. This theory is not established fact. It is a hypothesis, a bold one. But it has something that many other ideas lack. It connects physics to experience through a specific mechanism, and that makes it testable, which is the defining feature of science. So we now arrive at a new question. If consciousness is tied to quantum processes, what does that mean for our place in the universe? To answer that, we must expand our view beyond the brain and look at the cosmos itself. Because if this idea is even partially correct, then consciousness is not just a property of biological systems. It is a feature of reality at its most fundamental level. Now we expand the scale of the question, not by adding speculation, but by following the implications of what we have already established. If consciousness is not computation, and if it is tied to a fundamental physical process, then it cannot be treated as a local phenomenon confined to the brain. It must be understood in the context of the universe itself, because the same laws of physics that govern galaxies also govern neurons. And if a process is truly fundamental, it does not appear only in one place. It appears wherever the conditions allow it. Let us return to the mechanism we have been examining. In the Orch-OR framework, each moment of experience corresponds to an objective reduction event. A transition where a quantum superposition collapses into a definite state, not as a simple random jump, but as a process influenced by the structure of space-time itself. If that is correct, then every moment of awareness is tied to the geometry of the universe at its deepest level. Not metaphorically, but physically. Now, consider what that implies. The brain is not generating consciousness in isolation. It is participating in a process that is rooted in the fundamental structure of reality. Microtubules do not create the laws of physics. They operate within them. They provide a setting where certain quantum states can be sustained long enough to evolve. And when those states reach a threshold, determined by space-time itself, an event occurs that corresponds to a moment of experience. This suggests that consciousness is not a byproduct of complexity alone. It is a consequence of a specific kind of physical interaction, one that classical systems cannot support. one that requires coherence, one that requires a balance between isolation and interaction that quantum systems uniquely possess. Now let us connect this to something measurable. Brain activity shows oscillations around 40 cycles per second. These gamma oscillations are consistently associated with conscious awareness. When awareness is present, they are strong. When consciousness is lost, they diminish. This is a robust empirical fact. In the Orch-OR model, this frequency is not arbitrary. It corresponds to the rate at which objective reduction events occur, roughly 40 moments per second. Each one a discrete instance of experience. What appears continuous may in fact be constructed from a sequence of tightly integrated events. Now consider another phenomenon that classical models struggle to explain. Anesthesia. There exist many anesthetic substances, chemically diverse, structurally unrelated. Some are simple gases. Others are complex molecules. Yet they all produce the same effect. They remove consciousness while leaving much of the brain's activity intact. The heart continues to function. Neural firing persists. Basic processing continues. But the experience disappears. This is not what we would expect if consciousness were purely a result of neural computation, because different chemicals should disrupt different pathways in different ways. But instead we observe a convergent effect, a consistent elimination of awareness. These substances tend to interact with hydrophobic regions inside proteins, regions that are also candidates for sustaining quantum coherence in microtubules. If those regions are essential for maintaining the quantum states involved in consciousness, then disrupting them would disrupt consciousness itself. This is not a final answer, but it is a pattern that demands explanation. Now widen the perspective further. Quantum effects in biology are no longer theoretical speculation. They are experimentally observed. In photosynthesis, energy transfer occurs with efficiencies that indicate coherent exploration of multiple pathways. In certain animals, navigation depends on quantum spin dynamics. These processes occur in environments once thought too noisy for coherence. Yet they persist. This tells us something important. Biological systems can be structured in ways that preserve quantum behavior long enough to matter, not by escaping physics, but by working precisely within its constraints. If that is possible in these systems, then it is reasonable to consider that similar principles could apply in the brain. Now step back and follow the chain. The universe begins with fundamental laws. Those laws give rise to particles and fields. Particles form atoms. Atoms form molecules. Molecules organize into complex structures. At some point, these structures become capable of sustaining quantum coherence in specific configurations. Within those configurations, events occur that correspond to moments of experience. Matter becomes life. Life becomes aware. Awareness becomes self-aware. This is not a mystical sequence. It is a physical one. Each step constrained by the same underlying laws. Each step dependent on structure and interaction. And if consciousness is tied to processes that depend on space-time geometry, then every moment of awareness is a point where the structure of the universe and the structure of the mind intersect. We must remain precise. This does not imply that consciousness exists everywhere. It does not imply that every quantum event is an experience. The conditions required are likely highly specific, requiring organization, coherence, and timing that only certain systems achieve. But it does imply something profound. Consciousness is not outside physics. It is not an anomaly. It is something the laws of nature may already contain. And if that is true, then the brain is not simply producing consciousness. It is enabling a deeper process to occur in a structured and repeatable way. This shifts the question. We no longer ask how matter creates mind. We ask how certain forms of matter allow a fundamental process to manifest as experience. And in that sense, consciousness becomes not an accident of complexity, but a feature of reality revealed under the right conditions. And now we arrive at the final step. Not a conclusion, but a reflection. Because once we accept that consciousness may be rooted in the deepest structure of reality, the question is no longer only scientific. It becomes a question about what it means to exist in such a universe. That is where we go next. We have now followed the argument as far as physics allows. Not to a final answer, but to the edge of what we can currently understand. And if we look back carefully, step by step, without exaggeration, without mysticism, something very precise has emerged. We began with a simple observation. The brain processes information. But processing alone does not explain experience. We examined computation in its strict sense. Manipulation of symbols according to rules. And we found something important. Nothing in that definition contains experience. No matter how complex the system becomes, no matter how many layers we add, we remain within structure, not awareness. We then looked at the most advanced theories in neuroscience. They describe correlations, they describe functions, they describe how information flows. But they do not explain why there is something it feels like from the inside. The hard problem remains exactly where it was. So we asked a different question. Not how does computation produce consciousness, but whether consciousness is computation at all. And that shift forced us to examine physics itself. In classical physics, we found no place for experience. Only states and transitions, only measurable quantities, only external descriptions. But in quantum mechanics, we encountered something different. A domain where reality is not fully determined until an event occurs. Where possibilities exist simultaneously. Where the transition from potential to actual is fundamental. And within that framework, a hypothesis appears. Not proven, but precise. That moments of consciousness may correspond to physical events. Objective reductions of quantum states influenced by the structure of space-time itself. If that hypothesis is even partially correct, then the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Consciousness is not computation. It is not something that emerges from complexity alone. It is something tied to the deepest processes in nature. Now we must be very clear. This does not solve the mystery. It reframes it. Because even if we identify the physical process, even if we map every mechanism, we are still left with a profound fact. We know the universe from the outside, through measurement, through theory, through equations. But consciousness is known from the inside. It is not observed, it is lived. And that makes it fundamentally different from every other phenomenon in science. Now here is the idea to hold not as a conclusion but as a direction. For nearly a century, physics has struggled with the measurement problem. What causes a quantum system to take on a definite state? At the same time, philosophy and neuroscience have struggled with the hard problem. What causes physical processes to become experience? Two problems, two mysteries. And what we have explored is the possibility that they are not separate at all. That the moment a quantum system becomes definite, and the moment an experience occurs, may be two descriptions of the same event. If that is true, then something extraordinary follows. The universe is not only evolving, it is resolving. Moment by moment, from possibility into actuality. And in certain configurations of matter, that process is experienced from the inside. Now we must remain precise. This is not a claim that the universe is conscious in a naive sense. It is a statement about structure, about the relationship between physical law and experience. That under the right conditions, the same process that determines physical reality may also generate awareness. And here we are, temporary arrangements of atoms organized by the laws of physics, capable not only of existing but of knowing that we exist. Matter has reached a level of organization where it can ask what matter is. The universe has produced a system that can question the universe. And that is not a trivial fact. That is one of the deepest facts we know. I once said that nobody understands quantum mechanics. And that remains true. But now we are asking something even more difficult. Not only how the universe behaves, but how it is experienced. If these two questions turn out to be connected, if consciousness and quantum mechanics are different aspects of the same underlying reality, then we are not just uncovering another piece of physics. We are uncovering the relationship between existence and awareness itself. And that is not something we solve in a single theory. It is something we approach carefully, honestly, step by step. So we end where all good science ends. Not with certainty, but with a clearer question. If consciousness is not computation, then what exactly is it? And what does that tell us about the universe we are part of? Thank you for thinking through this with me. Because if you have followed all the way to this point, then you are already doing something remarkable. You are using the universe to understand itself.